Okay. So this Sunday we're talking about ascetical theology. Now what do we mean by that? Well, there is really no theology of prayer as a separate discipline. I mean, you think about there's all this theology of this and theology of that and that kind of theology and so on. I've never seen a book titled Prayer Theology or even Theology of Prayer. There might be something like that, but there's no kind of discipline like that. But what we do have is a category called spiritual theology, which might say is the study of spirituality. And then within that, you have basically mystical theology and ascetical theology. And in ascetical theology, what we're concerned with is basically spiritual growth and maturity. And prayer is just kind of the backbone of that endeavor. And so that's why prayer theology, theology of prayer, is really lumped in under what we call ascetical theology. Now, I can't believe that I haven't been able, since I started the class, I'm like, I got to find this book, I got to find this book, I got to find this book. I can't find anywhere my old beaten up copy of Martin Thornton's Christian Proficiency, which is a great book, which basically covers this kind of stuff. Oh well, so I just have to kind of go. Well, I should have thought to ask beforehand, but I'll just have to kind of go from memory. And then this is another great one, English Spirituality, which covers a lot of the same ground, but gets a lot more into depth on different English schools of thought, different teachers, different English saints, and so on. And when he talks about English spirituality, he's really talking about the prayer tradition, the ascetical theology tradition of the Anglican experience from the very first days that Christianity arrived in the British Isles up until now. So let's look at some of the definitions and terms that he talks about here. He says that spiritual theology is divided into ascetic theology and mystical theology. The former, ascetic, treats of the exercises required of aspirants to perfection. So it's all about, as we mentioned, Christian growth and maturity, moving to something better. Ordinarily, the soul rises to perfection by passing through 3 stages. First of all, it gets free from sin by penance and mortification. So that's really the beginning point of all spiritual growth, is trying to get free from this bondage of sin. And in a sense, you never really get fully past that, because even, at the most supreme heights of Christian maturity, you're still wanting to stay away from sin. So that's something that it's foundational, and it goes all the way through. Then it forms inner virtues by prayer and the imitation of Christ. So once you're set free from sin, then how should you live? Well, live the way Christ lived. Follow his example, look to practice his virtues, and so on. And lastly, it advances in the love of God till it reaches habitual union with him. So this is the union with God in heaven, the divine beatitude kind of life that we're aiming for. So when Jesus, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount, gives us the Beatitudes, he's painting a picture of what mature Christian people look like. What do the saints look like? What is the source of their happiness? It's not necessarily in what you might expect. It's not necessarily in things you found before. It's not in great riches and in prominence and in power and so on. It's things like, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, and so on. So we have a lot to learn from God about how to become closer in union with him. And in fact, that union with God is described, even though it's basically the same thing, is described in 2 parallel ways, in East and West. And they're not contradictory, they're complementary. And in fact, understanding one kind of helps illuminate the other. So in the West, we describe it as in visual terms, seeing God as he is. In fact, in the Catechism and the Prayer Book, in the back here, the outline of the faith. It talks about that being the goal of the Christian life ultimately in heaven is to experience God without any intervening, mediating thing between us, to see God as He is, which is an interesting way of talking about it because we're told that God is spirit. That means He's invisible. There's no matter to see. I've always thought about, Moses went in to visit with God, but no one was allowed to see God. Moses wanted to see God and said, well, I'll pass by you and you'll see me kind of move away from you. But to see my face, no, you can't do that. I always thought that perhaps the reason why that was prohibited is because it would destroy Moses' faith. If he got to see God and then there was nothing to see, where does that leave Moses? To see God as He is to see Him with more than just we experience in the here and the now. It is to know God as He really exists. Of course, Jesus is the incarnation of God. And so now we have a face that we can see. And so the incarnation is a part of God coming toward us, just as He brings us toward Him. And then in the Eastern Church, we should say in the Western Church, this seeing God as He is called the Beatific Vision. So the vision of God that's beatific, that becomes a source, a wellspring of happiness and fulfillment and satisfaction within us. So seeing God, knowing Him, is beatitude. Now in the Eastern Church, they have another way of expressing this, which is that of either you call it deification or theosis, depending on whether you're using a Latin descriptive or a Greek descriptive. But it's all the same thing. It's about becoming God, not in the sense of becoming your own God, but becoming one with Him, in union with Him, in communion with Him. And basically, it springs out of Peter's mention in, I think it's 1 Peter 2:4. I'm a little shaky on that, where he talks about becoming partakers of the divine nature. So God became a partaker of human nature, and that is not simply so He could come down to us, but so that we could advance toward Him. So we become partakers of the divine nature. Now, what does that mean? Well, we're left for a whole lifetime and more to explore. So let's look at more of what he has to say about this. He says the Catholic threefold rule follows this same pattern. It was not invented by St. Benedict. Fundamental to the biblical doctrine of man is the principle of total integration. Human beings cannot be split up into parts and faculties. Body and spirit form an indissoluble unity. So wholeness is always going to be a part of our Christian maturity and perfection. Nor can Christian life be split into departments, sacred and secular, religious and social. The Bible has nothing to do with religiosity or spirituality in its modern degraded sense. Christian prayer, therefore, is one integrated thing, a total life. And so we need to avoid this kind of intuitive, knee-jerk reaction of splitting our lives into different categories. Saying, this is my spiritual life. This is my spirituality. I hate that term because it implies that this is sort of just a separate part of you. Existence is spirituality, you might say. Just like existence is existence. We don't need to divide it up into a different category. Now he talks about basically a threefold rule is the essence of all Christian living. We're built around three things. So the New Testament gives us a threefold pattern, which is the heart of all Christian practice. Eucharist, or Mass, the daily office, that is the official prayer of the Church, and then our personal, private devotions, prayers. And so I've turned that into an acronym, or acrostic. I can never remember. MOP, MOP, Mass, Office, Private Prayer. He says, the church has never doubted its importance, and they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, in the breaking of bread, and in the prayers. So this is something that was given to us from the very beginning. A couple of terms we should become familiar with that he uses a lot are mental prayer. Mental prayer is a challenge, and it's a challenge in itself because of distractions. Thinking about God is very difficult, and so it's something that needs to be cultivated. And this is where handy-dandy devotional books come into play and are very useful. Spiritual reading, things like the St. Augustine's prayer book, things like the writings of the saints. For example, just off the top of my head, if you look in the St. Augustine's prayer book, you will find a section on visits to the Christmas crib. And so there's kind of a whole couple of paragraphs there, a couple of pages, basically a kind of guided meditation to lead your thoughts into, I'm here, I'm at the manger, this should be very important and spiritual, but I need some help. It just doesn't automatically well up within me. And so this is kind of get the pump primed. And so if you read through the visit to the Christmas crib, it'll guide you in your devotion. What should I be thankful for? What should I be praying about? What should I be thinking about? Another one is visits to the Blessed Sacrament. Again, you have a couple examples of a few pages of kind of a guided meditation. And you have a lot of these. And mental prayer often needs help, outside help. But the goal is to train our minds to engage in mental prayer without the help. And you'll find that when people come from other faith traditions where they don't have prayers in a book, and they discover the prayer book, it's a great sense of liberation and appreciation for what a wonderful tool. Those who grew up with it might tend to use it more as the limit of their prayer life rather than the beginning. But those who come from a tradition where they don't have written down prayers really kind of get it more than the rest of us who grew up with it. Because you see that, this is a place for me to get started. This is a place that will teach me how to pray, and that I don't have to stop there. I keep on going. I should have printed it up. But there's a great meme that was going around this week illustrating different ways of praying. So it was a guy asking his wife to, take something out of the refrigerator or whatever. And one of them is modeled after the way that charismatics pray. And so like her name is, Erin or something. It's like, wife, Erin, I'm just so glad to be here with you today, Erin. Wife, please open the door, Erin. Reach inside the refrigerator, Erin. Wife, please grab the milk for me and put it on the counter. This kind of like stuttery kind of prayers that you have in extemporaneous circles. And then the other one is kind of modeled after the prayer book tradition. O Aaron, who has vouchsafed to condescend thy will to engage in the blessed state of matrimony with me. We humbly beseech thee of thy great goodness that thou wouldst open the refrigerator and reach in and grab the milk and so on. So the prayer book teaches us how to pray, and we need that instruction. And especially, I think, when it comes to mental prayer. Once we have that starting point and kind of get used to it, mental prayer is really about engaging God, but on the inside, in our mind and in our heart. The other is what he calls acts of recollection. Well, I should back up. Contemplation is basically mental prayer. Contemplation. And we think about it, I'm going to contemplate the mysteries of the universe. I'm just going to think about it. That's basically what we're talking about with God. So he says ancient authors treat contemplation in relation to the entirety of the Christian life. For example, I've tried to explain elsewhere that a saint habitually living in a state of union with God may properly be called either a contemplative or a mystic. On the other hand, one of the most elementary spiritual experiences is a sense of union or harmony with creation, which is correctly known as the first form of contemplation. Similarly, such ordinary experiences as of the absorbed faith of William of St. Terry, the unitive love for which creatures associate with St. Francis, and simple wordless prayers of simplicity and loving regard are contemplative, since they imply a direct, intuitive awareness of God rather than discursive mental activity. It follows that virtues like penitence and recollection usually contain a contemplative element whenever they are qualified by the term habitual as distinct from actual. Habitual means you keep on doing it intuitively. Actual means you kind of plan for a moment. So he says the latter, actual, means a single isolated act of prayer. The former, habitual, infers a deep intuitive state, a relationship. Grace before meals is an act of recollection. We suddenly think of God and offer a short vocal prayer. Habitual recollection is continuous, even subconscious awareness of the divine presence everywhere. So when he talks about recollection, what he's basically talking about is saying your prayers. In fact, he uses that term a couple of times to kind of bring us back home. Oh yeah, that's what he means, is reciting some memorized prayers, or opening up a book and reading some prayers, or sitting around the dinner table and reciting grace or something like that. Recollection seems like kind of an odd term to use, but if we think about it, it's kind of, we're re-engaging that relationship with God every time we address Him again and anew. We're making contact again. You think about, sometimes you've been on the phone with somebody for a long time, and you just want to hang out and talk, and then neither one of you has anything to talk about, and so for a while you just kind of listen to each other breathe, and then you need to say something every now and then, just to let yourself know that you're still connected to that person, and they're still on the other end, they can still hear you, and so you just kind of come up with stuff to say. In a sense, that's kind of like what recollection is. You just want to remind each other that connection is open. Let's see. Some of the things that he makes note of here. Although many common Christian duties largely depend upon our free will, ascetical theology is grounded on the doctrine of prevenient grace. God always acts first, so there's a sense in which everything is His direct gift. And I would add, there's a sense in which everything is a response to His initiative. So this idea of prevenient grace, we don't use the word prevent in the same way anymore, except in the prayer book. In fact, in the traditional language edition of the 2019 prayer book, we're going back to words like prevent that are part of the old tradition. So prevent us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor. That's prevenient grace. And further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may, I forget how it goes after that, rejoice in thy holy name and have eternal life, and so on. So prevenient grace, God goes before you, prepares the way. He's His own John the Baptist. He's laying the foundation. He gives us faith before we have faith. He awakens ideas in us and virtues in us before we do it ourselves. So God is always laying the groundwork for our spiritual growth, laying the groundwork for our prayers. He says the main subject of this book is ascetical theology, dealing with the fundamental duties and disciplines of the Christian life, which nurture the ordinary ways of prayer and which discover and foster those spiritual gifts and graces constantly found in ordinary people. And so he talks about using contemplation and using recollection and so on. And we'll kind of look at that idea of a rule of life. And one more thing that we should talk about, ascetical theology, as we mentioned, deals with Christian proficiency or Christian perfection, that is spiritual maturity. And I think we need to dismiss from our minds kind of the the common concepts of those terms. When we talk about perfection, it's not like there's a status of 100% and we want to move toward it, and then we get there and we're done, game over. It's more like living into our design, living into the fulfillment of what we're created for. And to be perfect, in fact, is a teleological description in the Bible when Jesus says, "Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." What he's talking about is fulfilling your design in creation. Be what you were made to be. And so proficiency, perfection, he says to be perfect, according to St. Thomas, means to fulfill the function for which one was created. And the Church embraces a diversity of function. Hence the need for care in the interpretation of hierarchies and progressions, and the need for recognizing the eternal adoration of God in glory as the only purpose for which mankind was made. So in other words, our life can be very simple, not something that you would consider to be Hall of Fame at all, and yet we can be perfect. If we're avoiding sin, if we're staying in constant contact with God, if we're habitually practicing virtues, that is Christian perfection. That is Christian proficiency, Christian maturity. And that's what the monastics, the religious, were always going for. They say, we don't want to wait until heaven. We want to live heaven right now. And part of what you need to get from here to there is a guide or rule. And so let's look at this handout, Rule of Life, which basically is a summary of what he has to say in Christian proficiency. Now, the first thing we need to dispel is when we use the word rule, that we're not talking about a list of rules. Now, your rule of life may be a list of rules, but probably a better word to use would be plan, or maybe strategy or method. And in fact, if you think about the Methodists, what is the method of the Methodists? The method of the Methodists is to live the life, the devotional life laid out in the Book of Common Prayer. Remember, the Methodists, the Wesley brothers, were Anglicans. The Methodist movement began as kind of an Anglican revival. And the revival was simply kind of getting back to the basics. And that's really what all revival movements are, is just going back to the basics and getting it right and actually doing it. And so it was about living out the pattern set forth there of daily prayer and the sacraments and the calendar and all these kinds of things. So rule is from the Latin word regula, from which we get regular, a pattern, a method, a strategy, a plan. So rule is the pattern, model, or example by which we wish to intentionally shape our spiritual lives, particularly our prayer lives. So some of the things that Thornton points out about this idea of having a rule is, and of course, religious orders have a rule for the whole group. So St. Benedict has his rule that he wrote out, and St. Francis has his rule, and St. Basil, and so on. But here he's really talking about your own kind of personal rule, your own personal plan, strategy, the kind of thing you are encouraged to come up with for Lent. But really that's something we need to make for our whole lives. Number one, he says, rule is embraced. It's not promised or vowed. Now remember, we're not talking about religious orders here. So religious orders, they take vows and embrace a rule to a more stringent way. But here he's talking about an ordinary person. So a rule is something that is embraced. It's not an oath. It's not really even a promise. It's not a vow. It's not something that's a sin if you break your rule. And that's something that's often confusing to people. And when people come to confession, a lot of times it's, I didn't do something in my rule of life. I was going to go to church on every Wednesday or something like that. Well, God didn't say you have to go to church every Wednesday, unless it's a particular feast day that the church has raised to the level of an obligation of a Sunday. But rule is a personal plan and a strategy. So he says rule is embraced, you engage with it. Number 2, rule is wholly opposed to legalism. And he recognizes that when we're talking about rule of life in ordinary people, legalism is the big trap. And it's so easy to fall into that trap. And so we kind of constantly have to remind ourselves that that's not what rule is about. Don't even think about in terms of breaking your rule. Rule is not something that's broken. Rule is something that is embraced, lived into. It's a pattern for life. So you wouldn't talk about, what's a good example? I broke my rule of breathing when I was stunned to see this car crash in front of me, Well, that's not how that works, you just, it's a pattern and it was interrupted by something. So rule is a pattern that you embrace. It's not a set of laws, except that if you bring in God's laws into your rule, then that can be a sin, but not because it's your rule, but because it's God's commandment. So, for example, at a children's sermon, I used an illustration of, baking cookies, and I made a mistake. There's this white powder in this jar, and it wasn't labeled, and I thought it was sugar. Turns out it was salt. So I didn't make cookies. I made Play-Doh is what I made. Is that a sin? No, of course not. God never said, thou shalt not make Play-Doh. It's a fault. It's a mistake. I thought I was doing one thing, I accidentally did another, or even if you intentionally did it, just to be silly or play a prank on somebody or whatever, that's not a sin. A sin is when you transgress God's commandments or God's will, revealed will for your life. Sin is not when you break your own rules. So rule is embraced. Rule is not legalistic. It's not legalism. It's opposed to legalism. Number 3, rule is neither artificial nor a burden, but the principle of civilized life. And so in a sense, your rule needs to grow with you. And it needs to have some flexibility, and it needs to be something that's catered to you. So it's not something artificial. It's not a list. If it's a list, it's like when Jesus paints the picture of the saints in the Beatitudes, it's kind of like you're painting your own picture of what I want to be. And this is what I want to look like. And so I'm going to try to live into this pattern here. And so in a sense, rule can always be a little bit ahead of where you are to kind of challenge you, to keep you moving forward. But it's something that should be fitting. You shouldn't make your rule something I'm going to go pray shoeless in the snow every morning at 5 a.m. That's not realistic. It might be realistic if you do that 3 times a week already. Then it's not a big step, maybe to do it every day. But it's something that has to be not a burden, not artificial, but something that is just a part of lived life. Number 4, something that we mentioned before, breach of rule is not a sin. A sin is when you transgress God's commandments, not when you transgress your own ideals. And then number 5, which kind of came out of the others too, rule is and must always remain variable. So it has to be adjustable. It has to adjust with you as you mature in your spiritual maturity. It needs to adjust with you as your life situation changes. You grow older, you say, this is not something I can do like I used to do, so I need to make some adjustments to be suitable for where I am. It could be, your life, you move to a new place, you take a new job, your situation changes, so I can't do the same things. I can't follow the same pattern of daily life that I used to follow. So rule needs to be variable. It needs to vary if, I'm going to take a trip, I'm going to travel. I can't necessarily do the same pattern that I used to do. So I need to make adjustments.
Something that's attempted.
Well, what do you mean? It's something that sets before you a pattern to follow, but it has to be realistic. It has to be adjustable. It has to be flexible. And so he says in Christian Proficiency, rule, quote, is a help, not a hindrance, something liberating, not restrictive, expansive, not burdensome, in accord with the freedom of the Christian spirit, and absolutely opposed to legalism. It is always a means to an end and never an end in itself, and its content is only ascetical theology. That is basically rules about prayer habits and, what people would call spirituality. That could be, spiritual reading or taking a walk or whatever it is that kind of primes the pump for you in a spiritual way. He says it's most helpful to formulate a rule over time and with the help of consultation, such as a spiritual director. And so, if you're going to form a rule of life, the best thing to do is to come up with one point first. Make it small, make it bite-sized, and master that before you add something else. So maybe you might say, I'm going to start with, every day when I wake up, I'm going to say the Lord's Prayer, or I'm going to make the sign of the cross. Just keep it simple and small, and once you do that for like a couple of months, and it becomes routine, becomes habit, then add something else, Well, let's look on the back. All coming out of the same resource, ideas for turning ordinary living into Christian living. First, spiritual disciplines. Clean up your soul with the mop. Remember, the mop is his threefold rule that comes from the New Testament: Mass, office, the official prayer life of the church, and P is private or personal prayer. Number 2, formulate some kind of rule of life. Get started, at least. Come up with something that is a pattern for you to follow. Be intentional and devotional about worship. That is, you already do some things. Try to capitalize on them. Try to make the most of them. In fact, what I want to put out, I was hoping to have it ready for today, but I wasn't satisfied with it yet. And it still needs a little bit more work. Is I want to put out a little very simple kind of card, booklet of the Saturday preparation. That used to be a big thing, especially among Anglicans when a typical parish didn't have communion every Sunday. They had it less frequently. And so there was kind of a build-up to it. The pastor was supposed to announce, on 3 Sundays hence, I will be celebrating the Lord's Supper. So be sure and get ready. Prepare your hearts, and so on. And so you made a special recollection of your sins and maybe a confession, and you said certain prayers of preparation and so on. Well, every Saturday needs to be an intentional time of preparation. We find this in the tradition, the Eastern tradition of the Saturday Vespers. That's always kind of a part of, in a sense, the Sunday morning Eucharist. Turn ordinary occasions into prayer occasions. That is, attach prayer to stuff that you already do. The most obvious, straightforward example is mealtime. I'm not going to eat until I pray. I definitely want to eat, so I'm going to pray. But you can attach it to things like every time I get in my car and pull out of the driveway, I'm going to say a little prayer for safety, or prayer to bless the people that I pass by today, or something like that. So take things that just happen in your life and try to make them spiritual, make them tools of Christian proficiency. The second segment is embrace church customs. We have all of this treasure house of resources there to live a life that's planned out for us in a pattern to follow. Let's just follow it. Let's be Methodists. Let's do the method of the prayer book. So the first one example is following the church calendar. And Jenny Shaw is great at this, engaging in the customs and the culture of the church about keeping the year and keeping the calendar and celebrating the feasts and the fasts and so on. So keep in mind of the changing of the seasons, of the special holy days that come up, the feast days. Maybe get yourself a book of the of like the Penguin Dictionary of Saints, and follow your church ordo calendar that we put out, and look up the saint of the day and read about them. There's a lot of apps on your phone that you can use for this kind of thing. Observe the Friday abstinence. So abstaining from red meat on Fridays in commemoration of the crucifixion as a kind of penitential thing to give us that mindfulness of Christ's sacrifice for ourselves is something that we need to embrace. It's in the prayer book. Unfortunately, we're far more governed by custom than by law in comparison to the Roman Catholics. For the Roman Catholics, everything is written down in canons and laws and so on. Ours is a lot more about custom. And so the rubric in the prayer book just says in a general way that Fridays are to be observed with special disciplines of fasting and self-denial. But it doesn't lay out what that is and how to do it and what counts and what doesn't and so on. We're kind of left on our own. We're left to the realm of custom. So a lot of times we turn to the Roman Catholic and say, now what is the specific rule about what counts as a red meat and what doesn't count? I've heard chicken is white meat. Does that count or does that not count? Or what about fish or what about this or what about that? So sometimes, it helps to have some specific rules to follow. But the main thing is the main thing, which is to engage in some self-denial.
It's suggestive rather than steadfast, right?
Well, no, it's prescriptive. The rubric in the prayer book says these are to be observed with self-denial. It just didn't say how to do that. And so we're left to the realm of custom more than anything else. So basically it's refraining from beast flesh is the old term, which I really enjoy. Red meat. Fish, why does that not count? I don't know. I have no idea historically why that doesn't count. I need to find out the answer to that because that's what people, inquiring minds, want to know. Correspondingly, just like we have the Friday abstinence, we should be feasting on feasting days in Christmas and Easter. Do a preparation before receiving Holy Communion. These are the kinds of church customs we need to embrace. Make an intention before worship begins. In our worship booklets in the pews, we have a form, some suggested prayers to start out with. And some of it is kind of a fill in the blank of what it is that I want to ask God for today. Bless the priest, bless the congregants. What else do I want to bring before the Lord? Observe the Eucharistic fast. What is the Eucharistic fast? That's basically no food before you receive Holy Communion. If you're not going to receive Holy Communion, that's not a big deal. If you're sick, you're not obligated. If you're elderly, you're not obligated. If you're a young child, you're not obligated. But if you're just a regular guy and, it's not going to mess up your blood sugar or something like that, not going to do you harm, just hold off. Make Jesus the first meal of the day. In a sense, the Eucharistic fast is not so much about fasting as it is feasting, but start the feast with the Lord Himself. So just hold off. And now in the Roman Catholic Church, most recently with Paul VI, they basically started reducing the time period on the fast. Customarily, it was from midnight, in other words, the entire day until you receive. They reduced it to an hour, which is basically a joke, because it's not even an hour before the service begins, it's an hour before you receive, which means that for the 10:15 Mass, you could stuff your face with donuts and muffins and everything else over here, and then walk into the church and receive Holy Communion, because an hour will have elapsed unless you bring food in with you into the church. That doesn't really count for anything. So embrace tradition on this. Make Jesus the first meal of the day. Briefly, create family traditions. So do special events related to special days. Put religious imagery in the home. And not just as decorations, but use them as tools for prayer. That's one thing that, particularly as Western Christians, we don't do well. Very often, we're okay with religious imagery, but we just don't use it in the sense that it hangs on the wall or whatever and looks pretty, and that's it. It maybe gives us some good feelings, but we don't use it as a tool the way they do in the Eastern Church. They're a lot better about that, and especially I think it centers upon their theology of icons. Icon is almost like a window into heaven. And so if I'm going to look out the window and see a saint standing there, I'm not just going to say, hey, that kind of looks pretty. It kind of turns your attention to engage with the saint and engage with heaven and engage with these things. So, when we have a crucifix in our home, we should engage with it. We should make the sign of the cross whenever we pass in front of it or something. Yes, use it, find ways to use these things as tools, not just as decoration that you might get at Mardell's or something. Use body language when praying as a family. For example, light a candle, turn and face the east, or turn and face toward a cross when you're making a prayer. Make the sign of the cross, kneel down for prayers. There's all these things we can do physically to engage our prayer life. Rather than just exercise our brain, bring the rest of your body into focus as well. I remember as a Baptist coming into the Episcopal Church, and one of the most refreshing and engaging and rejuvenating things was just having kneelers in the church, being able to pull that thing down and kneel on it. And you could kneel in any church if you want to, but if there's no kneelers and nobody ever kneels, you kind of be a weirdo. But, just having that there, having that something that you can do with your body, and not just having a group of people sitting or standing and saying, Lord, we kneel before you today, and nobody's actually kneeling. Instead, you can kneel down and say, Lord, we kneel before you today, so on. And finally, use the prayer book for meal blessings and devotions. The prayer book is there to be used, and we just have to practice at it. We have to make it a habit. We have to engage it. It's not like the Bible. The prayer book is not something that's meant to get dust on it. And the only way it doesn't get dust on it is if we use it. So let's make use of it. Next time, we'll talk further and more in depth about different methods of prayer and different kind of schools of prayer. Thank you so much.